Hi, Chkasiyam, Niquilia. Hi, Chkasiyam, to the youth. Or as my grandma says, a little flower. Say hi, Chkasiyam, to the Lekwungen people here. Hi, Chkasiyam, to our relatives in Musinich. Hi, Chkasiyam, to our relatives in Tisuk and Malahat. Asa the Echlia, Ahinat sa Lekwungen, Ahinat sa Kakwakiwak Namgis, and married in the creek. Good day, my honorable friends and relatives here today, our honored guests who are standing in solidarity with our youth and with Wet'suwet'en and Unasto'en. I raise my hands and say, Hai Chkasiyam, thank you, in the Lekwungen language. Thank you to our youth for standing here, for being the beautiful flowers that they are. I come from the Songhees Nation here in Victoria through my father's side of the family, which is Lahikawat, Skip Dick, Linda Dick, and Samet David Dick. Through my mom, I have roots to the Kakwakiwak Nungis people in Alert Bay. Her family is Norman Seaweed, the late Beverly Williams, and my mom, Hatwina Pulagwa, Leslie Seaweed. I raise my hands to the traditional holders of this land, the Lekwungen-speaking people of the Songhees and Esquimalt Nation. I raise my hands to my relatives in Wasanich Nation, because that's where my name comes from. And I always like to raise my hands to the other nations close to us too, to Suk and Malahat, so people realize that there's more than one nation surrounding us. Each of us have similar teachings. Each of us has songs to the land, to the territory. We have stories that we share with one another. My cousin here so graciously offered to stand with me. I'm so grateful for her presence here, and her strength. Standing here means a lot. So many people spread messages of protesting, hate, and violence, but this isn't what our youth are doing. They're protecting their inherent rights, protecting the inherent rights that each of our Indigenous nations has, being a voice for our relatives in Wet'suwet'en when they can't be here because they have to protect their land. But what we can do here is raise our voice, let you know what it means to protect, what it means to look after the land with a good heart and a good mind. That I chwalowin. We each have it, but so much we are clouded in our mind when we shouldn't be. The reason we acknowledge the territory and we welcome people here is because it's something that we've done for hundreds and thousands of years. Something that we do to honor each and every one of you here. Because we realize that in this day and age, so many of us come from different territories, cultures, nations, religions that we unfortunately can't go back to. And so it's our duty as people to this land to remind you to walk with a good heart and a good mind. Walk with that good heart and good mind that these youth have been doing. And I appreciate and honor them and stand with them. Me and my sisters each do. And so we remind you to walk lightly on this land, to speak speak kindly about these youth who are doing what needs to be done so that our elders can sit, so they can rest, so they can continue to tell us stories, so that we reclaim the language, the stories and the songs that were lost due to colonization. So I raise my hands to these youth here, raise my hands to all our allies, friends, and relatives who have come from near and far to be here, and welcome you who stand with the youth and say, Hai Trasiam, thank you.
Hello, my name is Takaya Blaney. I'm from the Tla'amin Nation, and I'm an Indigenous youth standing in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en, standing in solidarity with the Tyendinaga, the Gitsan, and the Shekwatmuk, who stand with the Wet'suwet'en. We stand with Indigenous land defenders everywhere who are getting criminalized by unconstitutional injunctions for simply occupying their traditional territory and abiding by our ancestral laws and governance systems, which have never allowed for trespass, which have never allowed for protocols to have so violently been broken. When the world witnessed Indigenous matriarchs, Wet'suwet'en matriarchs, be ripped from their place of ceremony and honoring missing and murdered Indigenous women, and be arrested in the name of a piece of paper, in the name of an injunction that prioritizes the profit of a pipeline over Indigenous livelihoods. We saw reconciliation, a colonial facade that Canada has never fulfilled, come crashing down on that day. For us Indigenous youth, our childhood has been witness to false promises and performative commitments by Canada that again have never been fulfilled in a meaningful way. As Indigenous youth, we declare that reconciliation is dead and that we set the terms for Canada's relationship with us on our lands, on our traditional territories, and for our future. I thank all of the Indigenous youth who have stood here, despite intimidation tactics from the Victoria Police Department, despite being threatened with arrest, despite not breaking an injunction, yet having armed police surround us as we try to sleep. This is Canada. This is what Canada has always been. And we remind witnesses that we stand here peacefully. And it's unfortunate that we have to always undermine our commitment to love and to peace, despite being surrounded by violence, colonial violence, a legacy of genocide that Canada continues to perpetuate. But it is the truth, because we are not moved by anger. We are moved by something greater than us. The force of our ancestors that we stand upon, the love for our lands and for our waters, that compels us to do what is necessary so future generations of Indigenous youth never have to face armed police on their own territories. Because that is what our parents' generation did and our grandparents' generation did. And that's why we are allowed to gather in groups that are larger than three, speak our languages, practice our cultures. Yet we are still being ripped from ceremonies. Matriarchs and youth and elders and chiefs are still being ripped from our lands violently. And we are here to tell our stories and to tell our truth and to remind you of your humanity. Canada, as a colonial project that has been built upon our extermination, and many Canadians have not been taught that the land that they walk upon is Indigenous, and it is sacred, and it is life-giving. And that is okay, because we recognize that that is a part of conditioning that we are here to open up a conversation about. These lands that you walk upon are sacred, and our children are getting criminalized for defending your children's future. Because the future of all yet to be born are intertwined and reliant upon the survival of these lands. It is unacceptable for Canada to continue to deny Wet'suwet'en hereditary leadership the dignity of having a good faith discussion, and is instead trying to push the Coastal GasLink pipeline through at gunpoint. But we Indigenous youth and Indigenous peoples all over this country and all over this world are taking our power back. And you see that with every single person who stands here, and all of their ancestors that stand with them, and all of the Indigenous people who are mobilizing across Turtle Island. Reconciliation is dead, but our resilience and our lands, our waters, our peoples, and our resolve to protect them is very much alive. Thank you.
On behalf of the Health Nation, I'm here and joined with my council colleagues, Megan Humschmidt and Travis Hall. And I'm also joined here with one of our youth, Saul Brown. And we bring a message on behalf of the Health Nation for all of the Indigenous youth that are here and across the country. The Health Nation, we are proud of your leadership, and we are proud of your strength. My ancestral name is Kawazi, and we're from Bella Bella on the central coast of British Columbia. And on behalf of our nation, on behalf of our joint leadership, and that includes our Helsik hereditary chiefs and our elected council, we want to thank you for your courage, for standing up for the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs. The BC and Canadian governments are refusing to take responsibility for honoring Indigenous rights and title and consent. And as one of our young leaders, Saul, who is right beside me here, has said, what happens to one can happen to another. What you do to one, you do to all of us. I'm here to say with my colleagues that we see you, we hear you, and we are proud of your leadership. We will not allow your voices and future leaders of our communities and nations who are here at the seat of the colonial BC government to say enough is enough. We will not allow your voices to be criminalized or marginalized by the provincial governments or the Victoria Police. We have a word in our language, Ejistut, and it's about making things right. And what these young people here are doing here and across the country are making things right by ensuring positive change, and that positive change that will happen in our communities. You are all bright lights in our communities, and you are shining a light on the ongoing injustice that cannot continue if we are ever to have true reconciliation in this country. I want to thank all of the Indigenous youth that have been standing in solidarity here and across the country. I want to hold my hands up to our young leader here, Saul Brown. You know, we're at a very pivotal and critical point in our history as Canadians in this country. And we just want to let everybody know that the Helsik Nation supports the Indigenous youth We support the Wet'suwet'en Hereditary Chiefs. And we just want to let you know too that with that support comes our love and our resilience and our courage. Thank you.
My name is Shaylin Sampson. I'm Gitsan and Wet'suwet'en. I come from the House of Swilk from the clan of Lechkibu. As you've seen across the nation, Indigenous people are standing up for the Wet'suwet'en. We're standing up for Indigenous rights and title and Indigenous sovereignty, including our home nation on the Gitsan territories up in northern BC. Just 2 nights ago, a blockade in New Hazelton faced arrests of not only the media first, but then our Indigenous elders. 3 Gitsan chiefs were arrested that night. When the Gitsan people across all the villages in Hazelton heard about this, they came and they blocked Highway 16, the Highway of Tears. They refused to leave until our Indigenous leaders were let free. It's amazing to see the support that's coming out of this from our nation. At the time of the Delgamuukw trials, they called the Gitsan and Wet'suwet'en the hand that shook the world. Gitsan people are not going to stand down. We have an ancient alliance with the Wet'suwet'en people, and that isn't going to stop. We recognize that what happens to the Wet'suwet'en can happen to us. We are neighboring territories. We must stand with one another, and it's integral that we do so. Because how can we replace the land? How can we replace the salmon? How can we replace the water? We can't. We need to stand up for our lands and our sovereignty. This isn't going to stop. The Gitsan, they're ready to continue holding this government accountable. Our leadership will never back down, as they never have. Thank you. Anya.
My name is Gina Moet. I'm also a member of the Gitsan Nation from the Frog Clan of the House of Lutkitsiwits. The story of Canada's relationship with Indigenous people is getting so old. As we can see across this country, our people are standing up because we're sick of this. The curtain of reconciliation has been lifted, and we can no longer look away from these injustices. And now we have witnesses, settler people, and in this place where we've been holding ceremony, and when we were here last week, thousands of people came and stood with us to bear witness, us standing in our laws and our ceremonies, fighting for a future on this earth, standing with the Wet'suwet'en, because we want them to know that they aren't fighting this battle alone, that we see the work that they're doing for us all, and we're not going to sit by comfortable as the RCMP rip them off their territories. We as Indigenous young people, we have a responsibility to be here. We all have lives. We're students. We have jobs. But this is the work we're called to do, because our people have always stood up for our rights, even in the most oppressive situations during the potlatch ban and oppressive Indian policy. Our elders and our grandparents, our parents fought for us to be here, so that's why we're here. We want Canadians to know that this fight is so far from over, and that we come here together to fight for a future on this earth. The 2019 National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls declared in their report that there is a direct relationship between man camps and violence against our women and our girls and our Two-Spirit people. This is a national inquiry that Canada has recognized. And Canada chooses, with that information, to push through pipelines and exponentially increase man camps on our territories. On Highway 16, the Highway of Tears. Canada chooses over and over again to show us as Indigenous women and Indigenous people that we are disposable, that we have no worth. And so we're asking for Canadians to hold their leadership accountable, because this isn't just about a pipeline. This is about our survival. And what has been said before is that what we're fighting for here is so that the next generation doesn't have to be sitting on cement steps night after night to get these politicians to listen to us. There's a reason why John Horgan and Trudeau won't meet with these chiefs, is because as soon as they meet with these chiefs, they affirm that they are the leaders and the rightful owners of their own territories. We all know that economically it doesn't make sense for Trudeau and Horgan to not meet with these chiefs, and so we have to ask ourselves, why is that? And the root of this issue is that they don't want to give our people the recognition that we own our own territories. Because every other project they're going to try to push through our land, we'll be able to say no to. And so this struggle that we're fighting is going to continue. And we need to be able to hold these leaders accountable, and we need to do everything in our power to peacefully put pressure on them to meet these chiefs. Because if this pipeline goes through, we know that they're going to put any project they want through any of our territories. And we're in the midst of a climate crisis, and this affects every single one of us. And so we're asking for Canadians to join us, be united in this struggle. It's time. It's no coincidence that Canadians are standing with us. They're waking up. They're starting to understand that the settler government doesn't serve them either. Their leaders are selling out their futures as well. Doyak Seat Nissim to everyone who stands here and keeps us safe on these steps and watches the RCMP and keeps them accountable. Doyak Seat Nissim to our ancestors who fought this struggle for so long so that we could be here. Doyak Seat Nissim to all these relatives, all these youth who have come from different nations, who know who they are, who know their laws. Hamia.
Here are demands for Canada, for BC, and for Canadian officials. We are Indigenous youth from nations across Canada standing independently in solidarity with all 5 clans of the Wet'suwet'en Nation who have unanimously rejected the Coastal GasLink project. In standing with our Wet'suwet'en relatives, we will occupy ministry offices, rail lines, and legislative and parliamentary precincts in order to hold all levels of the Canadian government responsible for their perpetuation of Canada's genocidal legacy. We are committed to holding Canadian officials accountable. This means continually returning to their spaces of governance and law until Canada abides by Wet'suwet'en traditional governance and law. It is our inherent responsibility as Indigenous youth to resist injustice and defend Wet'suwet'en sovereignty. We recognize that the Wet'suwet'en upholding their responsibilities to lands, waters, and climate justice protects our collective futures. Indigenous youth stand in solidarity with all Indigenous peoples defending their lands across Canada, from Wet'suwet'en to Tyendinaga. We resist the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and Ontario Provincial Police violently criminalizing Indigenous peoples for demanding the bare minimum of Canada. Through these shameful arrests, The world has witnessed the colonial facade of reconciliation come crashing down to expose the Canadian reality of Indigenous genocide that has never been interrupted or reconciled. Indigenous youth across the country declare that reconciliation is dead. We condemn the coercive tactics employed by CGL, the lack of meaningful dialogue from the Canadian state, and the overall attempted erasure of Indigenous rights, title, and law. The situation on Wet'suwet'en territory has revealed the true nature of Canada's predatory consultation practices. It has been made clear the Indigenous nations do not have the right to free, prior, and informed consent. The ongoing raid against the Wet'suwet'en shows that saying no results in a paramilitary invasion. Good faith negotiations do not look like seizing Indigenous lands at gunpoint, while simultaneously denying critical programs and services to our communities. Not only is the RCMP raid of Wet'suwet'en territories a coercive force on behalf of Coastal GasLink, but so is the systemic treatment of Indigenous peoples in Canada. Our communities should not be subject to predatory consultation practices that exploit cycles of poverty that Canada intentionally maintains, meanwhile generating immense wealth from our territories since colonization. Boil water advisories, near extermination of traditional foods like wild salmon, caribou, and buffalo, as well as underfunded social health and education programs accessed by regular Canadians, are all coercive conditions for negotiations with industry. This is the inescapable economic component of ongoing colonization. There is undue pressure for Indigenous nations to engage in impact benefit agreements / mutual benefit agreements with environmentally destructive projects. The economic oppression of colonization is leveraged by corporate interests and supported by the government. The impact benefit agreements negotiations are a corrupt process that is not equivalent to true consent. Our human rights as Indigenous peoples are inherent and cannot be contingent upon the transaction and annihilation of our lands. As Indigenous youth, we will do everything in our power to protect our future and Wet'suwet'en lands from destruction. It's time for Canadian officials to do the same. If you do not stand with us, you are complicit in ongoing injustice. Our generation and all future generations of our nations will remember those who took a stand against genocide. We will also not forget those who were complacent in ongoing colonial acts of violence. We demand that the leadership of British Columbia and Canada enter into nation-to-nation discussions with the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs in order for these discussions to take place in good faith and without duress. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police must be withdrawn from Wet'suwet'en territories. All ongoing RCMP patrols and surveillance must also cease. The removal of the Community Industry Safety Office will not satisfy this requirement unless all our RCMP activities are discontinued. Coastal GasLink must cease activity and withdraw personnel from Wet'suwet'en territories in accordance with the eviction that was issued by Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs on January 4th, 2020. Canada must critically examine how the systemic treatment of Indigenous peoples in Canada is a coercive factor in negotiations with industry. There can be no free, prior, and informed consent, while many Indigenous nations in Canada still have boil water advisories. British Columbia must revoke all permits granted to CGL, especially in light of the BC Environmental Assessment Office's rejection of CGL's technical data report. British Columbia must also cease its defamation and criminalization of Indigenous leaders and governments. The inflammatory rhetoric of BC Premier only serves to incite hate and violence against Indigenous peoples, standing up for our inherent rights and livelihoods. Canada must cease the criminalization of all peaceful Indigenous solidarity actions and blockades that exist because of Canada's failure to adhere to diplomacy and meet with Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs. Call off OPP from Tyendinaga Mohawk territory. It is time for you to act upon your responsibilities. From the Indigenous youth standing in solidarity with Wet'suwet'en.
Amasa. My name is Neela Cox, and I come from the Gitxsan Nation, from the house of Zibasa, from the village of Anspayaks. I just want to make it clear, that we are not anti-pipeline protesters. We are Indigenous. We've been given many labels in the past, and all of these labels have been used to discredit our message, to discredit our laws and our governments. We've been called uncivilized. We have been called savage. We have been called lazy, drunks, dependents. But in reality, we are the Indigenous peoples who have always upheld our laws, who despite countless years of assimilatory policies and genocide, continue to stand on our feet, to uphold our governance systems, our leaders, and our territories. What is happening in Canada is not new. This has happened time and time again across the history of this nation. From its very inception, Canada has sought to displace our governments in order to facilitate access to our territories. And we are only seeing the most recent iteration of that struggle. From Oka to Ipperwash, to New Caledonia, to Gustafson Lake, to all the different struggles where we have seen the Canadian state use violent police force, paramilitary force, to push their agenda onto our territories, despite our laws and despite our right to consent. With this history, you're starting to realize that reconciliation may have never existed in the first place. That reconciliation was merely empty rhetoric in order to justify the ongoing colonization of our territories. That reconciliation was merely a catchphrase in order to ensure financial certainty for the industries that seek access to our lands. Reconciliation never had anything to do with Indigenous peoples. We were simply an inconvenience to the ongoing exploitation of our territories. Right now, it should be made clear to all that the rule of law in this country has never been just towards Indigenous peoples. Going back to the Indian Act of 1876, predatory chiefs of my territory were arrested when the surveyors came to impose the reservation system and the band councils on our territories. They were arrested by the same policing forces that are currently invading Wet'suwet'en territories. And once they returned, they were herded onto those reservations like pigs in a pen. And on those reservations, we needed permission to leave. We were constantly surveilled. We needed the authority of the Indian agent in order to do even the most basic things, such as sustaining our families and upholding our livelihoods. After 1880, in the 1880s, the potlatch ban took effect, and our governments were made criminal. We were forced underground. It was a criminal offense to gather in groups larger than 3, to speak our language, to uphold our ceremonies, and to live our lives as we always had. And yet still, the hereditary governance systems persisted. In 1927, this government made it illegal for us to pursue land claims in courts, to seek assistance from lawyers, and to generally use any tenet of the judicial system in order to uphold our rights and livelihoods. And that wasn't changed until 1951. And immediately following 1951, we went to the courts. We began to prepare maps, evidence, documents, correspondences, going all the way back to the early 1800s, very clearly outlining our governance, our laws, our boundaries, our territories, and who are the decision makers on those territories. And this all came to a head in 1984 with the initiation of Delgamuukw First British Columbia. And with Delgamuukw First British Columbia, the hereditary chiefs of the Gipsaan and the Wet'suwet'en, they presented over 350 days worth of testimony to the courts, clearly outlining our governance structures and our laws, clearly outlining the boundaries and who has decision-making authority over those territories. And yet, in 1991, Alan McEachran of the Supreme Court of British Columbia, the same court that has recently criminalized Indigenous law within this country, the same court that issued the injunctions that allowed for the invasion of sovereign Wet'suwet'en territory, the same court declared that British Columbia had extinguished our rights and title on the basis that we were uncivilized, that we lived nasty, brutish, and short lives in a constant state of war of all against all, and that we existed on a lower echelon of civilization without the wheel or the written word. This is the rule of law in this country. That is what we've had to deal with as Indigenous peoples. And so, that decision was appealed at the BC Court of Appeals, and then later at the Supreme Court of Canada. And in that court, the 6 justices unanimously rejected McEachran's decision. And they made it clear that British Columbia never had the authority to extinguish our rights and title to our territories. They made it clear that each house group of the Gitxsan and the Wet'suwet'en had a rightful claim to those lands of which they've occupied for millennia. And so following this court case, it has been made clear who the decision makers on those territories are. There is no excuse for this government to claim ignorance, to say that it's a complicated issue and it's purely internal within the Wet'suwet'en. That is a barefaced lie. Because this government is implicit in all of the divisions that it claims exist purely within Indigenous nations. The predatory consultation practices, the concerted efforts with industry to undermine our rights and title. This has been the strategy of Canada, of British Columbia. Because ever since that time, we've had to face a country, a government, a political system that has refused to engage us in good faith negotiations as recommended by the Supreme Court of Canada. We have had to engage with a country that has sought to undermine us at every turn, because this country is based on extracting resources from Indigenous territories. And so when the Premier makes statements saying that they will not pull the permits, saying that it's a done deal, the inflammatory rhetoric, the stubbornness, when the Premier makes it clear that they are not open for these discussions, it is because they are fighting for Canada's continued exploitation of our territories, unhindered by Indigenous law. Because Indigenous law would hold this country to account for its actions, not only now, but over the course of our history. The rule of law is currently being used, as it always has, to criminalize our people, to detain us, and to erase our voices. Currently, across this country, mass arrests are taking place of Indigenous peoples on their homelands, on their territories, because they recognize what is happening on Wet'suwet'en territories sets a precedent for all Indigenous nations who are seeking to uphold their sovereignty. Because if free, prior, and informed consent looks like an invasion of your territory at gunpoint, what does that say for the rest of us? Especially when it is clear that Canada has no intention of fulfilling its promises in regards to climate change, and it still intends to push these projects through our territories and to extract every drop of oil and every ounce of gas from these lands. But still, the point here is that Indigenous law, for us as the Indigenous youth, takes precedence. For our ancestors, it takes precedence. For our future generations, it takes precedence. We are upholding our very livelihoods. Our laws are not something that are imposed from above. They're something we each carry individually within our hearts that are passed down from generation to generation. They are integral to who we are. And our laws, our culture, our language, our livelihoods, they are all deeply intertwined with our territories. And so for the hereditary chiefs, it is their duty to continue on with our culture, our language, our history, by protecting our territories. They are responsible for the people. They are accountable to the people. The hereditary chiefs have the complete authority to protect their territories on behalf of the people. So we stand here upholding law from each of our nations. And in doing so, we honor the Wet'suwet'en and what they are doing on their territories. We honor the example they have set for all sovereign Indigenous nations throughout this country. But right now, it is the Canadian government that needs to be held to account, because they have not exhausted every possible avenue. They have not fulfilled their commitments to Indigenous peoples. Instead, they have initiated a series of violent raids all across this country against Indigenous peoples who are standing in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en. They are weaponizing the injunction process in order to remove us from our territories and to remove us from our blockades and to remove us from this conversation. And meanwhile, the government and the media need to be held to account, because we cannot simply be painted as dissidents. We cannot be simply painted as protesters, because this issue is much deeper than that. This goes to the core of Canadian society. And more, people are starting to realize the gravity of this situation. And still, this conversation needs to be held at a much deeper level than simply saying people are late for work, people are inconvenienced, that these protesters are hurting our economy. Because right now, Indigenous lands are being taken at gunpoint. Our government is dodging accountability, and our government is weaponizing its laws in order to undermine and remove Indigenous peoples from their territories. We need inquiries. We need protests. We need people to hold this government to account in every way whatsoever. Because even recently, the BCCLA and the UBCIC revealed statements regarding an unpublished report from the Complaints Commission that oversees the RCMP, making it very clear that the RCMP are going beyond their legal authority in these matters, that these exclusion zones have very little basis within Canadian law, that the actions they are undertaking to suppress and arrest Indigenous peoples do not have a clear and definite basis within Canadian law. And when this government tries to dodge accountability by claiming that they have no oversight over police actions, that the police are simply fulfilling the rule of law, that is clearly not the truth. Because immediately following Justin Trudeau's statements regarding these blockades coming down, that is when we saw the police move in concertion against Indigenous peoples all across this country. They cannot dodge accountability by saying that this is purely a policing matter, when this is a nation-to-nation matter. Indigenous nations need to speak directly with the federal and provincial governments. This is the conversation that has to take place. Yet, the federal and provincial governments refuse to engage in these conversations. And so this is something that all of Canada should be in an uproar about. Because right now, the costs being accumulated by the railway shutdowns, the port shutdowns, the bridge shutdowns, the overwhelming use of police force, all these costs will probably far outweigh any of the benefits from this pipeline project. And so as Canadians, you have a duty to hold your government to account. Because right now what is happening doesn't make sense. It's immoral, it's illogical, and even to appeal to the people who otherwise wouldn't see us eye to eye, it doesn't make financial sense. You will lose far more money from trying to push this project through, because Indigenous nations will hold this country to account. The people will hold this country to account. And these railway systems that go all throughout these territories, they were placed on Indigenous land without consent. And so when we go and occupy those spaces, we are addressing colonial injustices. This is far deeper than just a pipeline issue. This goes to the core of Canadian society itself. And so if we are to properly address this, if we are to overcome the prejudice, the hatred, the racism that's currently being directed at Indigenous peoples across this country, we need to have these hard conversations. This could be a pivotal moment within our country. This could be the point in time where we change the trajectory of colonialism, where we can begin discussions regarding our future as peoples, nation to nation, to understand how we can live off these territories and how we can come to agreements. This could be a point where that change can happen. And when we say reconciliation is dead, that is purely by the hands of this government, because we have always been waiting for these discussions to take place. So now that reconciliation has died, this is the opportunity to meet us in good faith, to start these discussions as they should have started many years ago. And so, I will conclude by saying that what is happening right now needs to be covered in much greater detail. All across this country, there are stories unfolding. On my homeland, the Gixsan Lakiep, 3 arrests were made. Actually, many more arrests were made, but 3 of our hereditary chiefs, our leaders, our matriarchs, Wininit, Dawamuk, and Spok, the leaders of our people, were violently arrested by the RCMP last night. And when that happened, the Gixsan arrived and blocked the Highway of Tears, as was mentioned by Shaylin earlier. But one thing that needs to be noted is that once we arrived at the heart of Gixsan territory, there was not enough police in all of northern British Columbia that could have arrived there to suppress the people gathering. And now, for Indigenous nations, we have waited far too long for this government to be held to account. And so, if this government insists on escalating this situation through inflammatory rhetoric, through the criminalization of our peoples and leaders, we are deeply worried. Our hearts are heavy about what will come, because we have to stand up for our rights. We have to stand up for our territories. We have to stand up for who we are as people. We have no other choice. So please, I just beg of Canadians, hold your government to account. Withdraw the RCMP and Coastal GasLink from Wet'suwet'en territories. That is simply the first step that can be taken so that these discussions can take place in good faith. And from there will be a long and hard conversation that needs to take place to determine the future of this country, and for Canada to reconcile with the fact that sovereign Indigenous nations exist and we aren't going away. Amiya.
Wallace Gayasika, to the youth who shared here at the press conference, Wallace Guyasaka, to the leadership of the Ilfdel that made the trip down. Wallace Guyasaka, to our relative from the Lekwungen Nation. And Wallace Guyasaka, to all those who came to witness. So we will now be opening this up to questions from the press. Be mindful of time. We have always said that we're going to stand with our relatives, with the Wet'suwet'en Nation, stand with our Gitxsan relatives, the Shuswapnik relatives, the Tyendinaga relatives, and all Indigenous people who uphold their lands, uphold their laws, uphold their inherent title and rights. And that means that we can come and go to their place of law and governance until they're held accountable, until they do better. And until that time, we will always be here, as our ancestors have since time immemorial, holding them accountable. So that question was, are there plans to stay here indefinitely?
So can you just reiterate what needs to change, just so we can get more concise, what needs to change in order for you guys to move on and for life to get on?
Sorry, that's just...
I'm not wording it very well, but in order for the protest to end, for you to feel like you're being heard, that the 5 hereditary chiefs are being heard, and for the process to continue towards reconciliation, although you're saying it's dead. Is that a possibility?
In order for our livelihoods to not be immediately interrupted in the immediate line of violence from industry, from RCMP, and from the forces of Canada, we call for RCMP to be removed from Wet'suwet'en territories, for Coastal GasLink to be removed from Wet'suwet'en territories, and for Canada to critically examine how structurally we have been oppressed within this country. And that goes beyond a pipeline, that goes beyond occupations of railways, that goes beyond protests and what Canadians are experiencing as an inconvenience. This has been a disruption to our life for generations. This has been a disruption to our relationship to our lands, to our relationship to our children, to our very spirits. And so until there are no boil water advisories, until our salmon have returned, until our youth can confidently speak their languages and not have to worry about facing injunctions and facing armed police for simply accessing our territories, we will not stop. This is about upholding our way of life for future generations. And I'm sorry that it's disruptive or an inconvenience to regular Canadians, but this is about our survival.
You can look it up online.
You can look it up in the media advisory.
It's quite obvious. That's your job to look it up. She's Takaya Blaney. She's not.
I just wanted to make something clear. Like the question just now is, what will it take to move on and to get on with our lives? We are being addressed as if we were individuals on these steps, but that is not the case. We have our nations behind us. We have our leaders behind us. We have our families, our clans, our ancestors behind us. So essentially what you're asking is, what will it take for Indigenous peoples to move on? But we aren't going anywhere. We have been here always.
Are there any other questions from the media? There is a press release, a media advisory that has gone out. There's also our statement of demands as well that Takaya has read out. And in closing this formal process, we said our thank yous. You know, we're here And this movement that we are part of is not out of hatred for others. It's not out of malice. It's not out of violence. It's out of love for our relatives in the Wet'suwet'en territory. It's out of love for our ancestors whose shoulders we stand on. It's out of love for the land and water. It's out of love for our laws that has kept us vibrant since time immemorial. So do not try to paint us as protesters or violent. We are peaceful, and we are here in love, and we are here in solidarity. So please, when you take this message forward, know that we are changing the trajectory of British Columbia. We are changing the face of this nation for all our Kalaliskayasika.